A data breach is a bad day. A grid breach is a catastrophe. The threats have changed and the stakes have never been higher. Welcome to Guardians of the Grid. Up next, we have Guardians of the Grid navigating the new era of cyber threats to infrastructure. And this is with Hemanth Tadepali, a good friend of mine from, a couple of years back now. I keep bugging this guy to do stuff, and he graciously keeps accepting. So I'm going to keep bringing him back. He's part of our advisory council from our Detroit event. Actually has a great session there. So if you're actually planning on attending that event September 11th, check it out. I'm just plugging it for you. But hey, welcome, Hemanth. If you wouldn't mind, for the folks that haven't tuned in and seen you on one of these things before, give us a quick backstory, if you would, and then off you go.
For sure. No, thank you, Tom, and thank you, SecureWorld, for having me. It's such an honor to be here today. So, I've been part of SecureWorld and part of various presentations throughout the organization the past few years. But a little bit about myself is that I'm a cybersecurity practitioner. The past few years, held different positions at various companies, at Google, Alex Partners, Mandiant, working in the startup sector. And right now I lead security compliance for a startup that's focusing on autonomous vehicles and transportation. That's the biggest buzzword that you're seeing today. And I'm looking forward to really talking more about, the area of where we're navigating threats to infrastructure. So again, a little bit about myself. I do have a bachelor's in computer science and a master's in cybersecurity, and started my PhD in cyber defense. Had to get one more degree. So a lot of my areas of research is around cyber policy, laws, security compliance, API security, threats and vulnerabilities, as well as the AV, autonomous vehicle security space. So looking forward to talking with all of you. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we just dive into the details, right, let's take a step back and understand why this conversation matters when it comes down to critical infrastructure. 90% of US critical infrastructure is actually privately owned, believe it or not. So what does that mean? That means that the responsibility for defending the systems we all basically rely on doesn't just sit with the government alone, right? It's shared with thousands of private companies, utilities, hospitals, transportation providers. And really, cybersecurity here isn't just a technical challenge. It's more of a cooperative mission. And so the risks are very real because in 2021, if you remember the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, that led to a gas shortage across the East Coast. And that was all from a single breach at one company. That incident showed us how a cyber attack can move quickly from the digital world into our daily lives. And energy really here is the center of all this because globally, it is the number one targeted critical infrastructure sector. And that is making more than up to 40% of reported cyber attacks, more from an operational technology standpoint. You're probably wondering why. Because if you disrupt energy, you are disrupting everything else, from transportation and healthcare to communication and even election security, which I'll talk about today. And so these aren't just isolated criminals, right? We're seeing state-sponsored groups like Sandworm in Russia and APT-33 in Iran. These all have launched targeted attacks on grids, airports, and pipelines. And so a lot of these are deliberately attempting to really undermine the trust, right? They're undermining the stability and really, most importantly, national security. And so going forward now, with the rise of AI-powered cyber attacks, adversaries are actually moving faster than ever. We've seen scanning, exploiting, and really disrupting at machine speed. And so the threats are evolving. And so really going forward, so do our defenses and critical infrastructure. Hackers have seen the ability to shut down water treatment plants we'll talk about today. They've triggered power blackouts and really disrupted rail systems. And so a lot of these incidents show that there's a line between cyber and physical infrastructure, and that line is disappearing, unfortunately. So to go ahead and get started, when we talk about critical infrastructure, I think it's really important to ground this in reality. What's truly at risk? First, obvious: electricity generation, transmission, disruption, distribution. These are all the systems that keep the lights on. These are what keeps the hospitals running, the industries operating. But it doesn't stop there, because the fuel supply chain, the pipelines, the refineries, and the distribution hubs, these are all equally vulnerable, in my opinion. So a single disruption in the energy sector can actually ripple more of an outward impacting method, where every other domain of critical infrastructure is impacted. And perhaps the most immediate risk is grid reliability, because outages don't mean inconvenience, right? They can affect millions, shutting down transportation, communications, and healthcare all at the same time. So one of the biggest studies I like to talk about is the Volt Typhoon's year-long breach, right, 2024 into 2025. This is not hypothetical, because between February and November of last year, a Chinese-linked group called Volt Typhoon infiltrated the operational technology systems of the Littleton Electric Light and Water departments in Massachusetts. So for almost a year, they had access inside the utilities OT network, and that's without even being detected. So think about that. Attackers with the ability to manipulate or shut down electricity distribution for thousands of residents, they're lying dormant, gathering reconnaissance, waiting for the right moment, right? It's a perfect example of why stealthy intrusions are really dangerous nowadays. And they also are allowing adversaries to prepare catastrophic events and actions in advance. Another big case study I like to talk about is just a few months ago, we saw how fragile interconnected grids can be. On April 28th, much of Spain, Portugal, and parts of neighboring countries went dark in a sudden blackout. And so the entire systems went offline. Transportation networks were halted, healthcare services were strained, and most importantly, communications were disrupted. The cause? It's actually still debated, believe it or not. Some point to suspicious command, logging and phishing with the malware resembling different attacks, and some strain used to in Ukraine's 2016 blackout. Others argue that it was a technical fault. There was a synchronization failure. There were some flash incidents, or even some rare, atmospheric issues that were happening. So here's a key takeaway: whether cyber or not, right? The event revealed just how fragile our grids are, because one incident can cascade across nations, and that's really highlighting the urgent need for cyber hygiene, our monitoring mechanisms, and our resilience planning. Something else that I'd like to talk about here to cover on the slide is that energy is the number one target, sector globally, with 40% of all cyber attacks gaining OT. The average cost actually for a major grid outage in the US is estimated at least $150 to $200 million per day. And that's not counting national security impacts. We've seen like interconnected grids, for example, that mean that a cyber incident in one region can really have cascading international effects across other regions. The US Department of Energy, though, they have identified the grid cybersecurity as one of the top national security concerns of this decade. So going forward, when we ask what's really at risk, the answer is simple. Everything that relies on energy, which in today's world is pretty much everything. So now that we've set the stage on critical infrastructure, and how this is increasingly throughout the entire area, let's take a closer look at some of the threat actors that are really targeting and shaping the landscape, and most importantly, the lessons that we can take from their campaigns. Volt Typhoon, is out of China. This is one of the most concerning nation-state actors targeting U.S. critical infrastructure today. They are specializing in what's called living off the land techniques, right? These tools already are native to the environment, like PowerShell, WMI, and many others. And so by blending into normal administrative activity, they are avoiding detection for extended periods of time. So their focus is not just simply espionage. They're working to establish persistent access into operational technology networks. And later on, this could be leveraged into a crisis to disrupt utilities or even energy providers. For defenders, this means that threat hunting has to look more subtle for anomalies, not just obvious malware. Another one that I like to talk about is the Sandworm, which is out of Russia. So Russia's Sandworm group is really, infamous for attacking Ukraine's power grid. Their use of different tactics and malware especially are alarming because it directly manipulates industrial control systems. So by abusing ICS protocols like IEC 104, they could open or even close circuit breakers remotely, and that's basically causing a large-scale blackout. So what this really shows is that adversaries are no longer stopping at stealing data, right? They're demonstrating the ability and the capability and even the intent to cause physical effects in the real world. So what can we actually do about these threats? So a few things that I like to talk about here is network segmentation. I think it's important to keep IT and OT environments separated with, I guess, unidirectional gateways where appropriate. And that's going to be limiting the adversary pivoting. Having patching and compensating controls, right? While many SCADA systems can't be patched easily, I think what we can do is really apply the compensating controls like strict allowing listing, secure enclaves, and really having access controls. Continuous monitoring is going to be important here too. Monitoring for a lot of the OT traffic for anomalies commands, like unexpected breaker operations or even other weird SCADA requests and queries that are coming in. A lot of that's going to be essential to detect the early stage intrusions. Most importantly, tabletop exercises, right? I think organizations should really regularly run incident response exercises with utilities and, most importantly, the federal partners here, because these are not just only here to refine technical playbooks, but are also here to build relationships across stakeholders. So responses are coordinated when, not if, right, a real attack occurs. So going forward, one of the things here is that when we are talking about cyber threats to critical infrastructure, few risks strike as close to home as attacks on water. So what's at risk and stake is more than just technology. It's public health, safety, national security, drinking water, safety and availability, right? This is all part of what we see right now when it comes down to critical water infrastructure. Most importantly, the dam integrity and flood control. We've seen wastewater treatment and environmental health being a big concern. So these systems form mainly the backbone of modern society. And in 2025, we saw chilling reminders of how just vulnerable they are. In Norway, for example, early this year, hackers targeted a dam valve control system in Norway. And so on the surface, the dam's role seemed modest, right? Primarily servicing a fish farm, but beneath the surface lay a really symbolic and strategic importance. So when it comes down to the attackers, we've seen pro-Russian hacking groups. And the way that they've been doing this is that they've been remote manipulating valve controls, likely enabling by a weak password, and more of having a lack of multi-factor authentication. And the effect from this is that approximately 500 liters per second were released over 4 hours, right? And that was a controlled but more of a deliberate disruption. So the attackers later released a video on Telegram overlaying with pro-Russian propaganda, and they were underscoring the political motivation. The second case study that I like to talk about here is just months later in August 2025, Poland faced at its own test. Hackers attempted to disrupt the water supply of a major city, and that was an essential lifeline for hundreds of thousands of residents. So the attack detection here was that authorities were able to identify the intrusion at its early stage. The response was that systems were rapidly shut down, and that prevented water contamination and even disruption. From an attribution stage, the attackers were not publicly identified, but Poland's prominent role in supporting Ukraine made it a prime target for hostile state actors. So this incident here really demonstrates how early detection and rapid response can really avert disaster, but it also highlights how water infrastructure, often less mentioned than energy, for example, or even financial systems. This still remains a high-value target in a lot of our geopolitical conflicts. So going forward here onto the next slide, let's kind of take a shift focus to the real adversaries behind a lot of these attacks, right? First, we're seeing KillNet. That's a pro-Russian hacktivist group launching DDoS attacks against public-facing portals. One example earlier this year targeted water districts, effectively disrupting access for customers and delaying public services. So what's important here is that these aren't just sophisticated breaches, right? They're about to be creating chaos, undermining trust, and most importantly, signaling political motives. APT-34 is another one. That's a well-documented Iranian state-sponsored group, and that continues to target industrial control system vendors. they have a really good technique when it comes down to spear phishings, and their campaigns are often leading to credential theft, which then enables them to exploit ICS environments. So that especially, is concerning because once an adversary gains foothold in ICS, they can pivot toward operational disruptions, thinking energy plants or even water treatment facilities. So we can't also forget about cyber criminal groups, so who don't even need nation state backing to cause major damage. They frequently exploit weak remote desktop protocols, through RDP access or even default PLC credentials, things that are actually surprisingly still common in critical infrastructure environments. So in many ransomware groups and incidents that we've seen, these are all tied to healthcare and manufacturing. So those misconfigurations were just the entry point. So what can we do? I think it's really important here to talk about patch electronic health records, right? Especially systems and connected medical devices, making sure that encryption is enabled for both at rest and in transit to safeguard sensitive data. Implement network segmentation for medical IoT and other connected devices so that if one endpoint is compromised, attackers can move laterally to critical systems. I think it's really, really important here to also run ransomware readiness assessments, which means that not only just having backups, but regularly testing backup restoration to ensure that they actually work when needed. So I think to end this slide here, I think one of the biggest key takeaway here is that whether it's nation state, hacktivists, or financially motivated actors, their tactics are evolving. Defenders have the ability to pair foundational security hygiene with proactive measures, like segmentation, behavioral monitoring, and resilience testing, especially to stay ahead. So when we talk about cybersecurity in healthcare, the stakes could be even higher. It's not just about data, right? It's about lives, to be honest with you. So the risks that we've been seeing is that there have been hospital operations and patient care. Cyber incidents can literally shut down ERs, delaying surgeries and stall many prescriptions. Healthcare, health records, for example, insurance claims, I think that's the backbone of healthcare administration. And so carrying sensitive and regulated patient data is really at risk. Medical devices, from MRI machines to insulin pumps, these are now digital endpoints holding critical patient information and even potentially subject to manipulation. In 2024, we saw one of the most disruptive healthcare cyber incident in U.S. history, and that was a Change Healthcare attack. So, what we saw there was that the entire U.S. claims processing backbone, hospitals, pharmacies, insurance faced outages. Cash flow dried up overnight, and patients faced delays in getting care and medications. What we saw there was that a suspected nation-state actor infiltrated Change Healthcare systems. The attack disrupted the processing of medical claims and payouts nationwide, and then the Department of Health and Human Services had to even intervene. So while United Health advanced over $6 billion to stabilize providers, reports indicate over 190 million records may have been even exposed. So the implications here is that a single breach can basically paralyze national healthcare finance and directly delay patient care. So this is not just an IT problem, right? It is a public health crisis. So another big case study that I like to talk about here is with Global Medical Imaging Leak in 2025. What was at risk there was that patient privacy, MRI scans, X-ray, blood work, deeply PII, PhD, these were all stored on interconnected healthcare devices. And so due to the weak passwords and poor configurations, data from more than 1.2 million devices worldwide, with the majority in the US, was actually exposed online. So the demonstrations that we've seen here is that this is basically demonstrating that the growing attack surface of IoT and healthcare, even without an advanced adversary, basic hygiene failures can basically compromise millions of patients. And so this is just a reminder that security must scale with connectivity. As we go on to the next slide, from a remediation and vulnerability standpoint, what we can see is that healthcare remains one of the top targets for advanced threat actors because of the high value of patient records and the reliance on critical systems that can't really tolerate downtime. So let's walk through a few of the most active groups and their tactics. So first is the Lockbit and Blackbasta. These are leading ransomware as a service groups. They have been especially successful through a lot of these phishing campaigns that we've seen and the exploitation as known vulnerabilities in VPN appliances like Fortinet and Citrix. So these are mostly often exposed to the internet, but once inside, they're able to move laterally, believe it or not, exfiltrate data and then encrypt critical systems. The double extortion model, which is data theft plus ransomware, is actually now their standard operating procedure. APT28, that's also known as Fancy Bear, that's a Russian state-backed group. So while traditionally focused on political targets, they've recently shifted toward healthcare and biomedical research institutes, and they've actually been using credential stuffing and exploitation of unpatched Citrix and Outlook web access portals to gain footholds. So this is really highlighting how geopolitical tensions directly spill into the healthcare, especially when researchers like vaccines or biotech intellectual property is at stake. The Interlock ransomware group, they recently made headlines in the DaVita breach. Their attack exploited unpatched Windows servers, combined with poor segmentation of medical networks. And so this actually allowed them to traverse from a single weak point into broader clinical systems. So this kind of reminds us that the basics, patching and segmentation, are often the difference between containment and catastrophe. So how do we defend against these three threats, right? I think some best practices is to segment IoT medical devices, testing ransomware readiness, encrypting data, both at rest and in transit, because you need to limit the blast radius if systems are even compromised. I know many IT professionals might not agree with this, but you need to aggressively patch, especially when it comes down to these platforms, VPN gateways, and making sure that there's connected medical devices that are securely hardened, right? And most importantly, I think it's important to deploy behavioral analytics and anomaly detection because many of these intrusions really rely on compromised user accounts. So I think it's important to detect unusual access patterns quickly, as critical infrastructure is to shut them down before any damage is done. So as we move forward into the next slide, transportation. As I mentioned before in the beginning of this presentation, I work at Main Mobility. We're focused on autonomous vehicle and transportation, making sure that people have access to transportation, but autonomously. This is a growing area when it comes down to transportations. Not just the car that you drive in every day, but you are taking the train, you are taking the airplane, buses, for example. Most importantly, ride hailing, right? So we're kind of talking about the systems that keep goods, people, and economies moving, right? And I think a cyber incident in this domain can really ripple across industries and even countries. Some key areas at risk to include here, airline IT systems and airport logistics. For example, here you have the ticketing platform, flight rescheduling or scheduling, baggage handling, and even passenger services. You have rail signaling and even freight transportation because traffic management, signaling systems, and coordination of cargo movement is all going to be critical. And then you have the port operations and the global shipping supply chain. And that means container tracking, customs, and access control systems. In 2022, LAX faced a cyber incident claimed by the pro-Russian hacktivist group Killnet. So, what was at risk? Airport websites, passenger services, and logistic platforms. There was a DDoS attack temporarily disrupting access to websites and even online passenger services. So while there was no physical systems being affected, the attack caused confusion for travelers and minor operational delays. And so the implications here is that airports are more of a symbolic target for hacktivists. And even if the attack doesn't affect OT systems immediately, it demonstrates potential escalation pathways that could really impact critical operations if exploited further. Another big thing that I'd like to talk about here is the transactions of APIs in transportation. Between your vehicle to your application, between one app to your ride, that's all connected through APIs. And if there was a single API that was breached or maliciously injected through a SQL injection attack, that could really disrupt the operations of transportation. The Port of Houston, one of the US's busiest ports, actually faced a serious cyber attempt in 2021. What we saw was their shipping logistics platform, container tracking, and the access control systems were at risk. So state-backed attackers actually exploited a zero-day vulnerability in a port system. And that quick detection by CISA actually prevented the operational disruption. The Now, a successful breach could have actually halted port operations. They could have delayed the shipments, um, even disrupted global supply chains. So ports are actually a high-value target because they are central nodes in international trade. Um, Overall, transportation systems are highly interconnected because an attack on one hub can actually disrupt multiple industries. Here, the OT risk is real because, while the LAX attack only impacted IT, rail signaling or even cargo access systems could be manipulated in even future attacks. And to end here, cybersecurity in transportation requires continuous monitoring. It requires the incident response, the planning, the collaboration with federal agencies like CISA and TSA. Um, and from a threat landscape, we talked about KillNet a bit. This was repeatedly targeted using DDoS attacks. And there's also APT41. That's for targeting supply chains, logistics. They're known for the SQL injections, exploitation of valid accounts, and their goal here is to often espionage, stealing intellectual property and sensitive operational data that can provide strategic leverage. So from a ransomware standpoint, a lot of these industries are actually targeted because financially, they are motivated ransomware actors. They are continuing to target ports, rail operations, and transportation companies. Their most common tactic is exploiting exposed Citrix or VMware servers, moving laterally into IT networks. Now, from a technical remediation and practitioner standpoint, I think OT hardening is going to be important. Segregate port OT networks, container scans, PLCs, cargo handling systems. Use different VLANs, straight to ACLs to really monitor the gateways. Pen testing is going to be critical here because I think it's really important to conduct the annual IT and the OT pen test for airports, for rail and port facilities to identify vulnerabilities before any of these adversaries can exploit them. Most importantly, I think it's important to also keep API in the scope of your penetration test. Another big thing here too is that as we're moving forward into a digital ecosystem of transportation with IoT vehicles, IoT devices and vehicles, and connected vehicles, a lot of this is going to become riskier, and so more security provisioning has to be in occurrence. So the next thing here is manufacturing and supply chain, right? This is important because sectors where cyber attacks don't just affect computers, right? They can also halt production, disrupt supply chains, and even impact food security. So I think the key areas at risk here are, production lines and just-in-time logistics. You've seen a lot of modern factories rely tightly on coordinated IT and OT systems. These can really affect both national and global food availability. Vendor dependencies and third-party risk. Even if a company's own system are secure, I think a single compromised supplier can bring operations to a standstill. The Toyota factory shut down in 2022, for example. What was the risk there is that productions of thousands of vehicles across Japan were at risk. Ransomware hit a supply system, cutting off IT connectivity. And so this actually forced Toyota to suspend operations at 14 factories for over a day. So the incident showed that even a secure, well-resourced company can be affected through its supply chain. In today's interconnected global economy, the weakest link can actually disrupt the entire production network. I think the other big thing that we can talk about here is the JBS meatpacking attack in 2021. Agriculture and food processing are equally vulnerable because in 2021, there was a REvil ransomware group that targeted JBS, and that's, again, one of the world's largest meat processors. So what was at risk here was that meat supply chains in the US and Australia. REvil actually encrypted critical systems, forcing the company to pay $11 million in ransom. Meat processing was temporarily halted. That impacted supermarkets and restaurants nationwide. And so this attack really shows that the food production is high impact, soft target. A single ransomware incident can actually quickly affect the consumer supply, the prices, and most importantly, the national food security. So from a standpoint of what we're looking at here, we've seen a lot of emerging threats, right? Nation states are now considering targeted agriculture for geopolitical leverage. Um, a lot of this is highlighting the intersection of cybersecurity and national resilience. And so when we go forward from the threat landscape, now that we understand what's more at risk in manufacturing and agriculture, I think it's important to talk about examples like APT-10, right? That's a Chinese state-sponsored attack, an actor. They have been focusing on supply chain espionage. They implant software and malware and third-party software updates or even vendor systems to exfiltrate intellectual property. And so these attacks often go undetected for months. They give adversaries a significant strategic advantage. And so it really underscores the critical need for monitoring supply chain security, and most importantly, validating integrity of software updates. Another big thing is dark side, right? This has been more a pipeline-related attack when it comes down to logistics. And so this usually includes a lot of the phishing campaigns early on and compromising VPN connections. So while their targets are often, using energy or relying on connected ERP, MES, and SCADA systems, the key takeaway here is that they are any extremely, facing connection is just a potential attack vector. So remediation-wise, I think third-party risk assessments that are mostly coordinated with NIST 800-171, ISO 27001, a lot of this is going to reduce the risk of supply chain compromised. Zero trust network access, right? Limiting suppliers, especially supplier access to only what is necessary, right? Role-based access control, using continuous verification rather than implicit trust. I think what's also important here is to monitor for data exfiltration, watch for unusual activity like DNS tunneling or SFTP uploads. A lot of this can indicate IP theft or even preparation for double extortion tactics. So let's talk about the voting machine. Fun fact is I used to serve on Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson's election security task force to minimize misinformation and disinformation across the state of Michigan during our election. So the electronic voting machine is being utilized all over the country, right? There's paper transit and there's also electronic transit. But what we've been seeing is that a lot of more states are relying on the cybersecurity mechanisms around this. So what voters can really use in the electronic ballot return option is that, you could mail it or you could actually go in person. Both ways are secure, right? But, there've been some, influences from threat actors and nation state actors that have been able to actually swing the election in one way or the other based on the misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are happening. So as we go forward, I think what's really important here is that direct recording electronic machines, right? These are DRE machines. These are allowing voters to cast their ballots electronically, right, through a touchscreen or just interface. We've been seen some software-based risks here, where software bugs and exploits, because if updates or even patches are not properly authenticated, malicious software can actually be introduced, potentially altering the vote tallies. Any network connectivity, for example, used for reporting results or maintenance can actually expose machines to remote hacking or data interception. We've seen many election security experts recommend air-gapped machines to really limit exposure, especially through human error during transport or even updates remaining at risk. Another one is the optical scan voting systems. A lot of these systems are relying on voters filling out paper ballots, which are then scanned and counted electronically. From a physical security risk standpoint, if scanners are tampered with, an unauthorized individual can alter results, right, or even insert fraudulent ballots. And the implications here is that while paper ballots provide more of a voter verifiable record, right, securing the scanner and the chain of custody is really going to be critical here to maintaining election integrity. Ballot marking devices is another big one, right? These are assisting voters in making a paper ballot or marking a paper ballot, which is then scanned and counted electronically. From the misconfiguration standpoint, if there was incorrect setup or software errors, these can lead to improperly marked ballots, causing votes to be miscounted or even invalidated. The implications here is that even minor configuration errors can affect the election outcomes. And so this is really emphasizing the importance of pre-election testing and certification. So as we go forward here on this chart that you see here, the arrows that are depicting the direction of information flow between component systems. And so the solid lines indicate flows typically rely on the internet or even other networks that are connected to the internet. The dashed lines indicate information flows that are typically airlocked from outside networks. And the dark blue box indicates systems that are typically deployed in individual polling places. The gray box indicates that systems are pretty typically centralized in the local jurisdiction's election office. So as we go forward, when it comes down to the best practices, I think it's really important to take a look at where can we as individuals, as people serving in Congress or the Senate, really give our time for cybersecurity and election security process. I think one of the biggest things is that many people are scared when it comes down to misinformation, disinformation campaigns. But if you're using the physical security mechanisms for a ballot box like the locks, doing audits, using strong passwords, role-based access controls, limiting internet connection, having an audit cycle for the chain of custody tracking when it comes down to those voter machines, I think, it comes down to election security, our state of elections are going to be a lot more secure, and having some validation and provisioning during the process. So to wrap up here, when it comes down to critical infrastructure, our infrastructure sectors are deeply linked, right? Because if a breach in one domain, like energy, right, this can cascade to transportation, to water, communications, healthcare, and even government services. So this means defenders must think beyond individual silos and really consider the system-wide ripple effect in any incident. The threat landscape is continuing to evolve. We've seen nation-state actors, sophisticated ransomware groups, and even AI-powered disinformation campaigns. These are targeting both physical systems and democratic processes. And so these threats are moving faster and even adapting more quickly than even before. And so this is going to be requiring equally adaptive defenses. The third part here is that many critical systems were actually not designed with cybersecurity in mind. What does that mean? So from older OT protocols to legacy voting machines, modernization has to be balanced with resilience and continuous operations. So you can't simply shut down a power grid or hospital system for a patch. So having more of an innovative approach, that's going to be necessary to secure them without disrupting services. And then the fourth one here is, defending the grid requires utility and unity, because no single organization can defend a lot of these systems alone. I think the public-private partnerships are going to be important here, sector-specific resilience efforts, and most importantly, when it comes down to the election, election integrity initiatives. I think you need to share intelligence, the best practices, and the incident data, really what's going to help everyone stay ahead of emerging threats. And to really conclude here, I think resilience isn't just technology. It's also governance and people, because cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. Training staff, enforcing policies, running tabletop exercises, and really embedding security into the organizational culture. That's as important as firewalls or even intrusion detection systems. So I think protecting our critical infrastructure requires, a lot of thinking, cross-sector collaboration. Doesn't matter if you're public or private partnerships, and a culture of shared responsibility. And I think, by understanding the interconnected risks, the evolving threats, and the role of each stakeholder plays, I think as a community, we can truly become guardians of the grid, in the new era of cyber threats going forward. With that being said, I do appreciate everybody tuning in. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm looking forward to having further conversations. But again, thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, SecureWorld.
Thank you. Great job, really. I honestly can't wait till I have to call you doctor. I'm looking forward to that day. So that'll be fun. I've got some questions for you, if you don't mind. We've got a few minutes left. I want to back up for a second. On one of your slides, I saw this, and I was just like, I hope this is wrong, but you said it yourself. Let me push this out here. Less than 25% of the watershed operators surveyed perform annual cybersecurity risk assessment. That's kind of frightening. Yeah. It is frightening. How do we fix this number? I mean, this needs to go way up.
For sure. No, I think there's a few things here, Tom. The reason why it is low is because what are they focused on at the end of the day? The operations of water, right? I think the risk
Right.
assessment is the last thing that's on the back of their mind. But if a lot of these corporate agencies that are dealing with wastewater systems reach out to CISA or reach out to a partnerships agency or even a consulting firm, they can provide it for you, right? I know it is money, but I think the money here is going to be a lot more important now than later, right? Because if you're willing to put in the investment for all of these risk assessments and the cybersecurity hygiene during the process and before a disaster occurs, like a ransomware attack, right? That's going to be saving a lot of that percentage, and more percentage means huger risk. So hopefully we can see that 25% go even higher. So I think it's going to be really important here going forward.
Yeah, definitely. Anecdotally, I mean, you said it, I've actually heard it on many of the sessions, and just in general, I mean, just the names of these attack groups, some of them are kind of silly. I mean, like Scattered Spider, Fancy Bear, Wicked Panda, Charming Kitten. I looked them up while you were talking. I get the nomenclature to them, but or who's naming them. Microsoft does some of them. CrowdStrike does some of them. They're kind of goofy, and they're not really all that fearful in my mind. I mean, are they just doing this as like a passive aggressive term for these people, or are they really supposed to inspire fear? Because I don't feel fear when it's a charming kitten, and those are anything that's cat related. It's supposed to be Iran. Panda is China, which now they're starting to sound like they're just stereotyping folks. And then bear is anything Russian, right? So I don't know I mean, it's just silly to me how we come up with these names.
That's a great question.
Anecdotally, I mean, what's next? Spotted tiger. I don't know. Anyway, I want to know this though about the voting machine one, because this one struck home to me, right? Because we all vote, or we should be. Sounds like you guys are doing a phenomenal job to physically secure these things, but how do we get past the social engineering, the misinformation, and that kind of part of it? Because I think that, to me, and this is just my opinion, I feel like that is really more the problem than something misconfigured on the machine. It's somebody just being lied to and they buy it. How do we stop that?
No, for sure. So the U.S. government's actually taking approaches with the new administration to combat misinformation and disinformation. And what's even cooler is that they are working with companies like Meta, like Google, social media platforms, to really mitigate the risk and to embed an AI profile within their organization to detect a lot of this misinformation, disinformation on social media and take down content, right? There's a lot of startups now in the ecosystem that are raising money as we speak, from venture capitalist firms to really combat the misinformation, disinformation campaigns during election cycles. I think the problem that we've seen too is that you might think the misinformation, disinformation is only at the federal level. Believe it or not, it's actually at the state and local level too, right? There are people that are running for the city councils and for the state representative positions, and they're facing the same challenges that they do at a federal level. So there are companies that are trying to combat this, on a social media basis, but also having the ability to upload a certain, file or a flyer or even a video that might be AI rendered, and it'll say if it's a positive or a false positive, or if it's misinformation or disinformation.
You guys got a lot of work in front of you on all that. I mean, it seems daunting to me that, because it's China and North Korea and Russia, and they of course want to sway things. I mean, that's just how it is. So I get it. Thank you for that. One last question, back to the infrastructure. Beyond preventing attacks, what does true cyber resilience look like for a critical infrastructure organization?
Honestly, that's a great question. And it really comes down to the partnerships that you're having from the private sector to the public sector. I talked about this during my presentation. Even though, like, the Department of Energy, you might think they're the ones that are responsible for their own security, but they do have to work with other third-party vendors and third-party operators, because that is what's depending on our operational needs on a daily basis. And so being resilient doesn't just mean doing it by myself and I know what I'm doing. but being collaborative and working with multiple stakeholders to really mitigate security risk in a lot of these technologies. And I think the resilience is cultural, right? Because resilience isn't just technology, right? It's also the governance and the people. Because I think when it comes down to this topic, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. The same thing with resilience. You need to train the staff, you need to enforce the policies, you need to run the various tabletop exercises, but cross-functionally. And so I think it's as important as having firewalls or even intrusion detection systems, but it's a cross collaboration and a mindset of to really mitigating risk together.
Fully agree. I mean, I'm not a security guy. I host all of this stuff. I hear a lot of talks and I'm part of that conversation, but like to me, it feels like there's a ton of technology out there, a lot of really cool stuff, a lot of cool tools that you can do for visibility and observability and fixing things. But really, I kind of feel like the process and the people need more attention now, particularly the processes. I'm hearing a lot of that as we go through some of these different sessions today, as well as some of the other events that I've done. So we gotta work on some stuff. We got work to do, but I think we can if we come together. That's the hard part, is coming together, getting everybody to drop their stuff and really work together. That's key, I think. So thank you, Hemanth. Always a pleasure having you here with us and doing a presentation. Check out on LinkedIn. You got a friend in the cybersecurity business. His name is Hemanth Tadepali. So link in with him and he can probably help you, right?